Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia, if you're not familiar with us. Today, we will have our new series, relatively new series, hosted by Ron Granieri. It's People, Politics, and Prose. And we'll be hosting Philip Gordon, who's the author of a new book, Losing the Long Game, The False Promise of Regime Change in the Middle East. Ron Granieri, our host today, is the executive director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. He's also a Templeton Fellow and a history professor at the U.S. Army War College. And I have to say that the events of our speakers today do not represent FPRI. They are expressed, they're the views of the speakers, and also to say that they are not representative of the US government or any other entity. They are their own. A few housekeeping matters. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Put any questions you have as we go along in that box, the Q&A box. There's also a chat box. Please don't put your questions in there. The chat box will be used for if you have a technical problem. We'll also be, throughout the program, posting links to maps for any topics that come up that would be of interest. Also, before I turn it over to Ron, I just want to say a special thank you to our supporters and members. We count on your support. We cannot bring you these events without that. So in addition to using the chat box for technical assistance and maps, we will also have a link to support us, and we'll also have a link if you're interested in Mr. Gordon's book. You can purchase it via our chat box. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Ron.
Thank you, Raleigh, and thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the latest episode of FPRI's series, People, Politics, and Prose, our program of conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. All of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us on Zoom, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. The history of American foreign policy in the Middle East cannot be understood without understanding how much of the region has been made and remade by American policy. In the 7 decades since the end of the Second World War, the United States has established and destabilized multiple governments, some multiple times, even before the more aggressive regime change wars in Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11. Repeated failure has not yet succeeded in disabusing Americans of the notion that changing regimes is a legitimate policy. One could argue that it is a particularly American flaw to believe that the US has both the special gift of democracy and the responsibility to share that gift with others, which gives them the right to alter governments. Imperial powers of previous generations would recognize the impulse, if not the rationalizations. Yet the story of American efforts at regime change in the Middle East is both particularly educational and, frankly, not very pretty, marked by humanitarian and political catastrophes and sins of both commission and omission. Assuming that we read history to learn from the mistakes of the past so we can make new ones, it is well that we take a moment to consider that history as we examine how American policy and imagine how it will and should develop in the years to come. Our guest today, Philip Gordon, whose new book, Losing the Long Game, offers a historical narrative of American efforts to change regimes in the Middle East, is an ideal guide for such a reflection, offering both a historian's appreciation of complex motivations and an insider's perspective on some of the most significant decisions of the last decade. And Philip H. Gordon is the Mary and David Boyce Senior Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2013 to 2015, he served as Special Assistant to the President and White House Coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf region. Before that, Dr. Gordon served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Dr. Gordon is the author of a number of books and articles on international relations and foreign policy and writes regularly for newspapers, including the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and Politico, and has appeared frequently on various television programs. We are delighted to have him with us today to talk about his book. Welcome, Philip Gordon.
Thanks, Ron. It's great to be here. Thanks, Raleigh, and thanks everybody for joining.
Sure. I want to start with a basic question, and that is, Tolstoy tells us happy families are all alike. You know, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. You look at your book traces failures of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East over 7 decades and a dozen presidential administrations. Most of the interventions turn out unhappily. Are they ultimately each different, or are they alike after all in their unhappiness?
That's a great place to start, Ron, because it allows me to talk about a little bit what is different and what's the same.
Right.
And there's certainly tons of differences, right? I mean, because you can easily ask, well, you know, using diplomacy to get rid of Mubarak in Egypt is not the same thing as invading Iraq. So what are you talking about? So what is similar, and why do I write a book about these different episodes that go all the way back to the Iran coup in '53, right up through President Obama's policy in Syria? What is similar about all of them, what they all have in common, is that they were cases in which the United States decided, as a matter of policy, that we were going to oust a regime that we didn't like for one reason or another, and try to put something different in place. And that's the case in all of these, even if we used very different means to do so. And again, supporting an armed opposition or a coup or using air power is not the same as invading a country. We did it very different ways. And we also did it for very different reasons. And this is where we're getting back to Tolstoy. They're also different in that sense, in that in some cases we did it to counter nationalism. Sometimes it was part of the Cold War struggle. Sometimes it was weapons of mass destruction or counterterrorism or saving lives. Sometimes a little bit of all of the above. So very different motivations, very different methods. But what they all also have in common, like unhappy families, is the lack of success. Mm-hmm. That we fall short of our objectives invariably, and there's not a single clear case of unambiguous success. It always costs a lot more than proponents of the action imagined in the first place. And there are always a range of unintended consequences. So that's really the lesson from it. No matter why you did it or how you did it, you end up, and last point on this, on the similarities, is the patterns are also the same, mm-hmm. in the sense that once we decide to get rid of the regime, we tend to overstate the threat, underestimate the costs, declare victory initially. That's kind of the title of the book, Losing the Long Game, because there's always a mission accomplished moment before things go wrong for a range of reasons that I'm sure we'll discuss.
Yeah. Well, and you make a point of saying that the original sin, it's the title of your first major chapter, is Operation Ajax in Iran, which overthrew the Mossadegh government and installed the Shah. Would we all have been better off if Mossadegh had survived the coup and Operation Ajax had failed? Would that have spoiled the taste for further regime changes?
Well, what is true, picking up on that last point, is that the perceived success in that case led to a number of other operations. Mm-hmm. Because at the time, and certainly, it's fair to say, initially it was perceived as a success, and arguably was, in the sense that we prevented the potential communist takeover. That was one thing that the Eisenhower administration was worried about, and put in place a pro-American leader who even, facilitated the entry of U.S. oil companies instead of British ones. So initially, at least, we can get to what happens later, but initially it's perceived as a success, and therefore not surprising that the Eisenhower administration then thought regime change was a good idea. And we do it, within a year in Guatemala, mm-hmm. getting rid of a government we didn't like there, and even start, later in the Eisenhower administration, planning for the Bay of Pigs to get rid of Cuba and Castro. So in that sense, it was original sin. And I admit, I stuck with that title. It's a little bit cheeky, but I kind of liked it because there's something about that notion. It's the first mm-hmm. post-war time that we actually did it. We thought it worked, and it led to other cases of thinking we could pull the same thing off. Now, it's, you asked the question, would we have been better off if Mossadegh had stayed in power? Gets into a whole bunch of questions like, we who? I mean, we Americans, Iran, the region. What I will say, just to be brief, is that, again, acknowledge that there were positive elements of U.S. support for that coup. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there are also some hugely negative ones, in the sense that it empowered a brutal and repressive dictator who ultimately was overthrown by forces of extreme Islamism and anti-Americanism, which we are still living with to this day. And so for 40 years, we've been facing an extreme Islamist regime whose origins really date back to resentment over the US intervention. So there we're entering the world of unintended consequences for sure.
Well, and that's what I think about with the problem with unintended consequences is that they are not only unintended, but they're almost always unanticipated.
Yeah.
And so going back to cheeky titles, right? I like losing the long game as a title, but it begs the big question of how long does the game have to be to say that you lost it, right? Is 25 years of success, we just chalk that up as a win, and whatever happens after 25 years is something different?
Yeah, a couple of points. One is, again, you can legitimately argue that in this crazy world, if you can buy 25 years moderately in your favor, then you do it, and you obviously can't be responsible for what happens after that. A lot of things, a lot of factors in the meantime. And yet, also, I think it's still worth thinking about this unintended consequences concept. Eisenhower, I quote this in the book, in his diary in October 53, so not long after the coup, writes, okay, so we got rid of this prickly nationalist guy, and we mostly did it because the British really persuaded us that the Cold War was at stake. And Eisenhower writes to himself, now, if the Shah will only be reasonable and the British show themselves to be conciliatory, this might all work out really well. Well, that was unlikely. When you empower a potential dictator and put him in charge of a country, potentially delegitimizing the monarchy once it became clear, as it was going to become clear, that the US was behind it, thwarting Iran's democratic development, which is another cost of the coup. Iran might have moved in a more democratic direction. And again, unintended consequences, essentially empowering the Islamist clerics, who then became the only sort of potential source of opposition to the Shah. So I think that was a bit of naivete on our part to think, well, now that we put in our guy, this will all work out fine. And nobody thought at the time what that would lead to, but it did. And then, by the way, that's the only case that I write about where you get a couple of decades of at least relatively positive outcomes. In the others, it's usually within the first year that initial feeling of mission accomplished starts to dissipate, and then the negative consequences come much sooner.
I guess that does that also largely answers the question, because clearly a dozen failed interventions doesn't necessarily stop the 13th if someone's determined to do it. Let me ask you a semi-philosophical question. That is there a sensible dividing line between regime change and democracy promotion?
It is important not to conflate the two. We often do so.
Right.
Partly we do so just as a selling point, frankly. The motivation isn't really spreading democracy, because if that were it, we could pick a lot of different targets than the ones that we tend to pick. There's usually some other reason. And yet it's a very American thing to justify it in terms of spreading democracy, even frankly to the point of absurdity when, and I give this case when, support for the Mujahideen in the 80s under the Reagan administration, we talked about them, or some talked about them, as if they were the founding fathers and were we call them freedom fighters. Actually, Carter started calling them freedom fighters, but Reagan really took it to an extreme. He welcomed them in the Oval Office and talked about how they represented man's desire to be free. And we knew better. We weren't spreading democracy to Afghanistan. This was hard-nosed realists, undermine the Soviet Union and make them bleed. But similar cases elsewhere, Iraq, Libya, we had the notion that in addition to whatever strategic benefits we would have, it'd be good for the people because it would lead to democracy. And that's one thing that's unambiguous here. In no case did our intervention lead to democracy, even in the slightest, sadly.
Right. I mean, I was thinking in your time in the White House and in the State Department, right? The Egyptian example is a particularly complicated one. The replacement of Mubarak is a move towards democracy, but then the problems of President Morsi suggest that we don't get democracy right away, and we end up with another military man as president. I'm curious, just to get specific on the Egyptian example, what went wrong with the American how many different things went wrong on the American policy towards Egypt?
So the Egyptian example is interesting, frankly, as all are all of the Obama examples, because this is ironic, right? That Barack Obama, of all people, finds himself doing regime change and democracy promotion in the Middle East.
Right.
You know, he got elected in large part because of his opposition to regime change, the Iraq War. You know, he famously gave that speech in Chicago about, you know, not opposing all wars, just dumb wars. And he even spelled out why it was a dumb war. And he didn't, again, ironic, you know, George W. Bush, who was about the freedom agenda, spread democracy, invade Iraq as a democratic example. Even by the end of the Bush administration, second term, Condoleezza Rice at State Department, Bush had pretty much walked away from that agenda. As the Iraq War went bad, you know, he sort of set it aside. So that's the irony, is you get a president who is skeptical of regime change, skeptical of democracy promotion, who had expressed his admiration for Brent Scowcroft and a sort of realist school of thinking before becoming president, and then within 2 years finds himself pursuing an agenda of pushing out Mubarak in Egypt to try to support democracy, and then doing the same in Libya, getting rid of Gaddafi, and then also supporting regime change in Syria. And that, I think, tells us a lot about the dynamic, about American strategic culture, about this can-do notion that we can achieve this, and about the seduction of thinking that if we can just get rid of the bad guys, they can move in a more democratic direction. And again, you know, sadly and frustratingly, that hasn't happened, and, you know, is unlikely to happen when we overthrow a regime.
And you raise an interesting point there too about American public opinion, or the pressure that American politicians can feel that there's momentum in favor of a change, and so it's hard not to get caught up in it. And yet, you also mentioned in the book that Americans have short attention spans, and so we start a policy without really knowing how it's going to end, and then we're not, you know, eventually we lose our taste for it. In what way do you see what is the role of the public in both encouraging and discouraging policies of regime change in the Middle East?
The public has shown itself to be persuadable. And, you know, you take the biggest cases, which we haven't really talked about, but Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a lot of public support for the initial regime change operations. Well, actually, Afghanistan's complicated because the initial, we're talking about regime change in the 80s against the Soviet-backed government or the post-Taliban. We can talk about the relationship between the two, but let's just say post-Taliban, there was very little opposition to the idea of getting rid of the Taliban, understandably, right? Al-Qaeda attacks the United States, they're harbored by the Taliban. In Congress, famously, you know, one single member of the House of Representatives voted against the authorization for military force in Afghanistan, and every other one voted for it. That was Representative Barbara Lee, who, very interesting in retrospect, made a speech saying, I'm just uncomfortable with what could be an open-ended authorization for military force that could lead to an open-ended war that we don't know how to end. At the time, that was just seen as ridiculous opposition to what we all knew was the right thing to do. But 20 years and $1 trillion later, it's
on the same authorization.
On the same authorization, which we have then used in other places as well, including Libya. So that's fascinating in retrospect to go back to that concern. But at the time, vast majority of Americans supported intervention and the war in Afghanistan, and similarly with Iraq. So American public, you know, tends to, sometimes the American public is, it's actually interesting, is responsible for doing it because the clamor for action and responsiveness and, you know, don't just stand there, do something. And in government, I certainly felt that in Syria when we were in the Obama administration accused of not doing anything. Congress, public, you can't just stand there, you need to do something. But the public is also fickle. And as soon as the costs start to become clear, then it changes its mind. And you definitely see that in Iraq and Afghanistan, where now majorities across the board are opposed to the war and don't think it's worth fighting in both of those places. And then in Syria, for all of the pressure to act and do something, and I think President Obama sensed this, which partly explained his reluctance to get directly involved, there's no public support for the costs of intervention once you do it. And by the way, that helps explain, you know, what happened in Libya, which we also haven't talked about yet. But Libya, there was, and a lot of the critique in Libya, maybe we'll come to some of the issues of like why this goes wrong, and, you know, the lesson is whether you should put in forces afterwards or not. But in Libya, that wasn't even an option because the public just wanted nothing to do with it. This is a sort of Iraq hangover. After Benghazi, you know, we had debates about whether we could authorize a single civilian to be in Tripoli as part of the US presence because there was so much hostility, public and Congress. So public, can be on both sides of this issue. And that's why one of, I say one of the lessons here is leaders need to think about this in advance and not just go with the whims of the moment.
Right. I see a question came in from Leonard Hill, and it's about Tunisia. And I guess there is an irony, right? The one place in the Middle East where regime change was successful is a place where the United States did the absolute least, had the least to do with it. Is that by accident, do you think?
No, I don't. I point that out in the book without, almost like leaving it for people to contemplate themselves. But it is just worth flagging that because people sometimes say, "Oh, you're writing a book about regime change in the Middle East. You have a Tunisia chapter." I don't include that for that specific reason. There was a change of regime in Tunisia, but it was not US-led regime change. We didn't call for it. We didn't assist it. We had nothing to do with it. And it's the one place where it's more or less worked out pretty well. There are other reasons for that. It's relatively small. They have a relationship with France. Actually, the Egypt precedent was a salutary message for the Tunisians not to push it too far on either side. The Islamists in Tunisia, having seen what happened to the Islamists in Egypt, knew that if they pushed too far, that's where they could end up too. So there are reasons other than the fact that we didn't do it, that it turned out relatively well. And yet you can't help but notice that of all of these places, the one that worked out best was the one that we had nothing to do with and didn't get involved.
Right. I guess it does help if the people living in the country actually want to change their regime, then that's a very different issue.
Sure, and that partly applies in other places as well. The people wanted to change their regime, but they couldn't do it without strong assistance from us.
Right. Well, you mentioned France in Tunisia, and in the time that you were at the White House, time you were at the State Department, how did the United States view the role of our international partners in either encouraging, discouraging regime change, or playing somewhere in between? I know the French were very interested in Libya, for example.
You definitely have to talk about the French in Libya. And we've gone about this different ways, which is again in this category of it's hard to find like single lessons where it works when you work with the allies and it doesn't when you don't. I mean, the Bush administration, the W. Bush administration, when they did Iraq, they obviously welcomed and sought lots of allied support. But their attitude was mostly, look, we're going to do this. We welcome as much support as possible, but this is our mission, and get out of the way, France and Germany, if you don't like it.
Right.
President Obama had the opposite view, of course. He didn't think the US should be doing these things alone. And that's why in Libya, he made it a point to make it a NATO operation and to work with the allies. And once we had done what we had unique assets for, turn the mission over to them. But of course, in both cases, you also get the same patterns of failure. So I don't think you can simply say that that's the main variable. But we also have to talk about the Europeans when it comes to Libya, because I would argue, and argue in the book, that that was the decisive factor that led us to do it. Once again, Barack Obama did not exactly come to office with an agenda to change the regime or to intervene militarily in Libya. That was not his, where he wanted to put his political capital. But, you get, after the revolution in Tunisia, you get uprisings in Egypt, Libya, Yemen. And of course, the situation there was Gaddafi threatening to massacre people in Benghazi, which was a dilemma for all of us. What do you do about that? But even so, Obama wasn't inclined to intervene, and most of his top senior national security advisors were reluctant as well, including Vice President Biden and Secretary of Defense Gates. So there was it was not a given that the United States was going to intervene in Libya, even under those circumstances. What then happened was, and again, I tell this story in the book because I went with Secretary Clinton to Paris for a ministerial, where she just heard relentlessly from certain allies, France, Italy, Britain, what are you guys doing? You need to lead. There are refugees coming into Europe. There's going to be a massacre. And in fact, it wasn't just pleading with us to lead. President Sarkozy told Secretary Clinton that French planes were already in the air. When she got to the Élysée Palace for a meeting, he said, Madam Secretary, our planes are in the air. They're going to hit Gaddafi's forces. If you tell me to pull them back, I'll do it, but we're going to do it. And that sort of jammed the United States. But it was the European pleading to get involved that I think helped sway Secretary Clinton, who also heard from Arab partners, but the Europeans led her to side with those in the US government who wanted to intervene. And Obama says, or at least Secretary Gates says that he thinks President Obama saw it as a 51-49 thing, but that Secretary Clinton's voice was decisive.
Mm-hmm.
It was decisive because the allies persuaded her to intervene. And then we get to the phase where Obama says, all right, fine, we'll do it. But then the Europeans need to step up afterwards.
And then they don't. And then, I guess the difficult thing is that everybody bears the responsibility for the mistake, but it is Americans who spend a lot of time absorbing criticism for what happens in Libya.
Exactly. They don't because they don't, and they never do enough. My conclusion is on all the, the lessons that you can learn from these various episodes. And one of them is just that allies never do as much as we think and hope. In just about all of these cases, in the run-up to the intervention, you hear arguments, we won't have to do it because the neighbors in Iraq war, plenty of smart people said, we won't have to do peacekeeping in Iraq. One, because it won't be an issue, which was really misreading, but also because the Turks, the Saudis, the Pakistanis, they'll do it. That was obviously fantastically wrong in Iraq. They didn't step up, nor did the allies. Now, again, some allies, Britain, Poland, sent some trainers to Iraq, but not nearly enough. Afghanistan, you have to say, NATO allies did quite a lot, but never enough. Libya, they did quite a lot, but never enough, and they certainly didn't send forces. So one lesson is never assume that the allies are going to do as much as you hope or as people are telling you they will. And President Obama, in retrospect, has said about Libya, he still thinks it was the right thing to do, but maybe he had too much faith that the allies would step up than he should have. Mm-hmm. To which I just respond, that has to be part of the assessment, because they're just not going to, for some similar reasons that we're not going to. And the Europeans weren't going to put in major forces in Libya. And as Americans, we need to take that into account as we think about it. Last point on this, Ron, is there's a corollary to this point that allies never do enough, which is that neighbors not only don't help, they usually interfere and actively spoil what you're trying to accomplish.
Right. It's rare that a neighbor wants, let's say, a potentially troublesome power. They're not going to want to see that state become a big success. They might actually like a little bit of weakness and chaos next door.
They have their own interests. In many cases, it's precisely that. Look at Syria. Mm-hmm. Russia and Iran wanted us to fail for a range of reasons. I mean, the Russians certainly wanted any regime change operation to fail because they opposed the whole concept that, if you rise up against your local dictator, NATO and the United States will come and help you militarily.
That's bad for business in Russia.
It's bad for, and they hated it in Georgia, they hated it in Ukraine, they hated it in Kyrgyzstan, they hated it in Libya, where they let us do it with a Security Council abstention. But when it came to Syria, they were like, we're going to do everything possible to make sure you fail. Iran had the same interests. So neighbors, unfortunately, have a lot of influence. They often want us to fail. And even if they don't, even if like us failing isn't their main shtick, they have their own interests. So Pakistan and Afghanistan, they're going to look after Pakistan. And if they think that having the Taliban as strategic depth vis-a-vis India is useful to them, that's what they're going to do. It's not like directly to make us fail, but it's what they think is their strategic interest. So again, note for future, next time you do that, don't assume that the allies will share the burdens, that the neighbors will be helpful. Assume rather the opposite.
Right. Well, and I've got several questions coming in. There's one here that I'm interested in from Jacqueline Reich, who talks about how the American public opinion support for action in Afghanistan and even in Iraq was built around, in part around creating a notion that the United States was directly threatened. And have there been efforts generally in the move towards regime change by U.S. administrations to claim that the existing regime is a threat to the United States, and that's the way that we justify it? And does the degree to which the government can convince the public that there is a real threat, does that shape public opinion towards, or public support or lack of support for the action?
Yes, and we usually do that, right? Again, because if you're trying to build public support among Americans, you have to persuade them that they have a stake in it. There are exceptions. I don't think Obama really tried too hard to make the case that Libyan stability was a direct interest of Americans, that we were somehow threatened if Gaddafi took over. That was more genuinely humanitarian. He was going to massacre a bunch of people in Benghazi. It was also strategic in the sense that, refugees would undermine European allies, but I think that was more of an exception. In most of the other cases, or all of the other cases, there is a strong dose of, we need to do this for the security of Americans, which again makes sense. That's how you sell things, right?
Sure.
And the best case of that, of course, was the Iraq War, where, you had the warnings about mushroom clouds and terrorism. And I think it's fair to say the Bush administration really stretched the intelligence and the analysis to create the impression that Saddam Hussein was a direct threat to the United States because he was potentially involved in 9/11, that he had supported Al-Qaeda, all these rumors about people meeting each other in Prague, that he would develop, Vice President Cheney went on Meet the Press and he said, we know that they have weapons of mass destruction to use against us and our allies. So we definitely overstayed. Again, that's part of my message. The next time a government or others tell you we must do this, or you at home in America will be threatened, there's a decent chance they're overstating that as part of the selling job, and be very skeptical. It's not to say that there aren't direct threats out there or that terrorism isn't a threat, but the tendency, it never goes in the other direction. It's always spun in the direction of, this is a direct threat to you and we must fight this over there, or we're going to have to fight it back here.
That is a universal, right? Whenever anybody says it's now or never, it's never, never. So your book, and both in its structure and I would say in its argument, that hovering over it is basically the question of how should the United States deal with Iran? That you start with the original sin of Iran, and by the end of the book, you're talking about how should the United States respond to the Iranian regime. And I see multiple questions from the audience on this subject about let's consider how well do you think the Obama administration's containment and engagement policy towards Iran, how well has that functioned, or did that function to actually encourage change in Iran? And how different, how would you assess the Trump administration's policy towards that? And then part two on that, which is just a bigger question, is what should the American attitude towards an Iranian regime be that, of course, has its own interests as a sovereign state, can do what it likes with its, what is the United States' responsibility vis-a-vis a country that may mistreat its people, may threaten its neighbors, but not always to the same extent at both times, right? How do you measure those things when you decide whether it's in U.S. interest to get involved?
Good questions. So you're right to observe that the current policy debate is hovering over the book. The book is a historical book, looking at 7 decades of U.S. policy, but to the extent there's a real current policy issue, it's inevitably Iran. And I acknowledge that up front, that I actually started thinking about this in the context of the Trump administration's Iran policy, as I watched them veer in a direction that looked like regime change in Iran, which is not the official Trump administration policy on Iran. It's behavior change. But when you actually look at the way they talk about it, and the support for protesters, and the maximum pressure campaign, and the acknowledgement by some of them, John Bolton and others, and at times Secretary Pompeo, that what they're really trying to do is squeeze Iran so hard that the people rise up and change the regime. That's what led me to think in particular, okay, fair enough, Iran's a real problem, but maybe before we do that again, I think, Ron, in your opening remarks, you said something about learning from history, lest you repeat it. It led me to think, well, before we do that in Iran, maybe it'd be interesting to look at previous cases where we intervened to change regimes in the Middle East for different reasons and in different ways, and how they turned out. And I do think that a lot of these lessons from the previous cases are relevant to the current debate. I don't think you could help but be struck by, as the Trump administration started to ramp up its announcement of the May 2018 withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement, there were elements that sounded like the ramp up of the Iraq War. I'm not saying Trump was thinking of a big invasion of Iran, but the hyperbole and rhetoric about the Iranian threat and the regime and weapons of mass destruction, and letting Iranians reclaim their past. And he was really doing a replay of a version of what we had seen before. So again, what I wanted to do is remind people, be wary of that when you hear it, when you hear that this is a direct threat to Americans, and also even more, because it is a threat, even more be wary of the notion that if we just squeeze them, then we'll get rid of the regime and put something better in its place. And that's where the track record, is terrible. It's never democratic. It hasn't been particularly aligned with the United States. But most importantly, it creates a security vacuum into which different parties are pulled, neighbors are pulled, and we don't have a solution for it. So in that sense, I think all of these lessons are highly relevant for Iran. And as I say in the book, and this gets to the second part of your question, so how does that inform current policy debate? If we had a method for successfully changing the regime in Iran, that would be good for Americans. To have an Iran that respected its people and dealt with its neighbors and wasn't pursuing nuclear weapons. The issue is not, should we wish that there be a better regime in Iran? Of course we should, but policy isn't about wishing. The question is, what will be the result if we decide, instead of containing Iran and dealing with Iran and managing the situation, which is the alternative to regime change,
right,
diplomacy, arms control, engagement, alliances, if we instead set out to undermine, squeeze, and get rid of the regime. And that's where I think, be very careful about the argument, oh, let's just do the latter. Because one, there's no sign that sanctions will do the trick. So many people put their faith that, we've really got them cornered now. They can't sell oil, we're squeezing them. There's not really a historic example of sanctions leading a regime to disappear. And look at some of the current cases. Cuba, right next door, we've been sanctioning for 60 years. The regime is still there. North Korea is way poorer than Iran. The regime is still there. And by the way, in the meantime, it got nuclear weapons and ICBMs. Venezuela, a few years ago, we decided to squeeze until the regime popped, and it's still there. The reality is, regimes can hang on for quite a long time. The people suffer before the regime suffers. And what you usually get with that approach is a lot of suffering, but also resistance and very little prospect of change. And then, so, if that doesn't work, sorry to go on so long, but right. That is, that's what we're going through now. So if the sanctions don't work, then what? Do you start supporting the opposition, or do you start using direct military force? And then what if the regime fights back like it did in Syria? So all of that, I think, is really relevant for, and it is a warning. I don't see what the Trump administration thinks it's going to be able to accomplish as the alternative to what the Obama administration was trying to do with containment and a nuclear deal.
Well, and you talk about, the whole question of sanctions, right? I guess we could have a whole program on the appeal and the fool's gold that sanctions can be. But you mentioned the issue of the suffering of the population, and a couple of our listeners have already raised this question of what do we do with the question of human rights, both as the United States or as an international community. If a regime is doing terrible things, and if it is possible to intervene to make them stop, what should a state with the enormous power of the United States and with its potential influence in the world, what should it do? Right.
It's a totally legitimate and fair question. And I try to be honest in the book. The easy thing to do would be to say, this was always a bad idea and we screwed everything up and everything would have been just rosy if we hadn't done it. That's of course not the case. In every one of these cases, these were horrible regimes. People were suffering. They were threats to their neighbors, and they were threats to their own people, or more than threats. They were actively harming them. So you do have to acknowledge that, and I think, and therefore acknowledge that when you don't do regime change, there are costs. You get the endurance of a repressive regime. I don't think that has to be forever, because I do think there are paths out of that, and I argue that in most cases, historically, the track record of engagement in economic development and détente increases the prospect that a regime will move in a positive direction, or even that there would be a change of regime in a positive direction, as opposed to the Iraq sanctions, Cuba, Venezuela models. So I'm not saying that you have to live with it forever, but you do have to acknowledge that there is a cost. The rebuttal, though, to the notion, what was buried in the way you phrased the question, I don't know if that was the way the listener wrote it, if we can use our power to do something to help them, shouldn't we do it? Everything is in that first part, if we can.
If we can.
Of course, I think so. If there is a way to intervene to stop that dictator from repressing or to support human rights, we should. The question you have to answer, though, you can't just wish that or declare it. You have to be able to do it. And in some cases, then you have to say, what does that mean? So, Syria is a great example of that. Bashar al-Assad is a horribly repressive dictator who's done miserable things to his own population. That's not the question. The question is, how can you stop him? Sanctions don't seem to have done the trick. Armed support for the opposition seemed to have just escalated a war rather than ending it. So then you're sort of put on the spot. If you're prepared to say, we as the United States should do whatever it takes. If we have to invade the country and get rid of leadership and rule it like we did in Germany after World War II or Japan, we should do that. I think that's a coherent argument, but then you have to own that. And that's where the World War II example sort of comes up when people say, we've done this before in Japan and Germany. Yes, we also fought a total war for 4 years and deployed 2 million troops and stayed for decades. If it's that important, then we should do that. But what I get impatient with and argue in the book is the notion that you can have it both ways. We don't have to invade, we don't have to deploy a lot of forces, we don't have to pay a big price, but we should do positive things like intervene to help people. And the track record again shows that modest interventions, with some sanctions or some armed support for the opposition or some airstrikes, that usually makes it worse before it makes it better. And you have to be prepared to do what really needs to be done. And then even when you do that, again, sorry, but Iraq is a good example of that, where the administration said, it is so important, we just have to do it, even if that means 150,000 troops and occupation and then a surge. But even under those circumstances, it didn't succeed in improving the human rights situation, at least in anything remotely like the near term.
Sure. So as both a historian and a former government official, do you think there is something peculiarly American about a fixation on regime type? I know that since I know that you've written about de Gaulle and France, that when the French criticize the United States, they will often do it with a world-weary sigh, and they'll say, you Americans are so unsophisticated and you don't understand the shades of gray and blah, blah. But do you think there is a particular thing about the United States that we get hung up on the idea that the regime is wrong and that a change in regime is both possible and desirable?
So you can see the de Gaulle biography over my shoulders.
I couldn't, I had to bring it up. I'm sorry.
Well done. At least you're not looking for your own books, which is what most people do, is they peer at a bookshelf behind a speaker. But there's definitely something American about, I wouldn't necessarily say regime type beyond what we discussed before about supporting democracy being a core part of what we think we're doing. We rarely just justify this in a pure strategic national interest thing. We tend to, because we believe in that domestically, and that's what people want to hear. What I would say is even more American, though, or uniquely American, is the notion that we can do it. Mm-hmm. This attitude that every problem has a solution, rather than the attitude that I think a lot of Europeans and others have, that some problems can't be solved and just have to be managed. Mm-hmm. It's very American to every problem has a solution. This derives, of course, from our history of having great power and having done great things. Every problem has a solution, and the solution is often the deployment of American power. And this can-do attitude that we can get it done, which is in many ways admirable. It's certainly necessary to accomplish big things if you don't believe, but it's also dangerous when you're wrong, or when you can't do those things. And I show this in some of the discussions of our interventions. That attitude just perpetuates the failure. It's a natural thing. You asked about being an official, and I think this applies to the military as well. It's most relevant in Afghanistan. Your inclination is to believe it can work, it will work, and it is working. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to go to work if you don't believe that. If your job is to help stabilize Afghanistan, and you've invested there, and even more for the military, you may have deployed there, taken risks there, or lost colleagues there. The cognitive dissonance of sort of coldly analyzing it and saying, we can't accomplish this, or it costs too much, is hard. And that's where you get, as the Washington Post revealed in their deep investigation, and those of us who have written about it have shown, this constant, we're turning the corner notion. And then every new commander says, all right, well, it's true that there were flaws and problems under the previous one, but I'm can do and I can do it. And that can go on for quite a long time. And that is quite American. I do think other countries, and especially Europeans, have realized, given their relatively limited power, there are some problems in the world that you just have to accept and manage and live with. You know, we did that during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We accepted that we couldn't transform it and fix it right away. So we managed. And that, you know, to tie it to your previous question about Iran, that's what I think, you know, we need to do on Iran. I would love to have a quick and easy fix to get rid of that regime and solve the problem. But chances are instead, we're going to have to deal with it and manage it and contain it.
And since there are a few questions brought up about the idea of non-military actions that can influence regimes, does containment include, say, the development of Voice of America and Radio Free Europe? Does it include influence operations? Does it include intelligence efforts to undermine or destabilize elements of the regime? Do those count under, you know, if we were coming up with a spreadsheet, right? Are those the regime change you don't like, or are those the containment that you think can be sensible?
I would probably draw a line, you know, you described a range of things.
Yeah, right.
On the side of the line that would be in containment, yes, broadcasting and information to, you know, get at these repressive societies so that they know truth and have more transparency. I think is absolutely a positive thing and constructive and helpful. When it then veers over into, you know, covert operations or other types of campaigns, you have to be very careful, you know, what it is you're trying to accomplish. If it is, frankly, fomenting revolution, you better be sure it's going to work and you're going to succeed, and the people you're helping are the people you want to take over. And that's where I would start to worry. And again, you know, be careful with the notion that there's some halfway point. We also have a tendency, and we saw this in places like Libya and Syria, where people are like, okay, I'm not advocating an Iraq-like invasion. We're not going to do that, and we shouldn't do that. But let's just do more. Well, how much more? So, like a little bit of armed support to the opposition, some air support and airstrikes. Because if all you're doing is that, and you're not going to succeed in getting rid of the regime, then you're just escalating and perpetuating a conflict in which more people suffer and extremism grows and refugees grow. And again, I would argue that's pretty much what happened in Syria. And, you know, that leads to the next. So if that doesn't work, do you escalate a little bit more? And then you get into a situation where, you know, you went into this maybe with the most notable motives, democracy promotion or human rights. But to achieve that goal of human rights, you find yourself arming, you know, extremist groups. You know, in Afghanistan, okay, the communists were repressive. We wanted to get rid of them. So then we're arming these warlords, and they're going on a rampage against each other and the regime in Kabul. And you get this savage civil war and a security vacuum. That's not doing a whole lot for human rights. Same in Syria. And in Syria, as anywhere, once you get to that point, the people you're trying to help are probably not the moderate, peaceful opposition that you wanted to help in the first place. If you're in a revolutionary, armed, civil conflict situation, I don't know who's going to come out on top, but it's not going to be the peaceful, moderate Democrats that you tried to help in the first place.
Right. We have just about a little less than 10 minutes to go. Several questions out there. It's hard to know which one to go with, but I want, since you mentioned Syria, there are a couple questions. Whether after January 20th we have the second term of the Trump administration or the first term of a Biden administration, what legitimately should the United States, should the American public, should people who are interested in the Middle East, even people who are concerned about human rights, what should they expect can or should be done with Syria as an international problem? Or is it really already over and we're just, people just haven't recognized it yet?
It depends what you mean by over. I mean, Syria will never be over. There are divisions, there are conflicts. But in terms of
Bashar al-Assad has won. If I said that, is this true?
Defining one. I mean, he's got a lot of problems on his plate, so it's hard to really describe that as victory. If that's winning, you know, I'd hate to see what losing. But
very fair.
You can also see what losing looks like. But I do think the operation, since we're talking about regime change to get rid of him, is over, and I also described that in the book. You know, it was a gradual process. It was, you know, the United States gradually got there, right? At first there wasn't regime change, and Obama finally, decided that he would make a statement that Assad had to leave, and then we started to do things to make that happen, and sustain that for a while, and then it started to, come down the other side of the hill. Okay, the whole regime doesn't have to leave, just Assad and his cronies, and then after that, doesn't have to leave right away, but there needs to be a plan for him to leave. And then countries who were once gung-ho about overthrowing him start to realize, well, he's going to be there anyway, so maybe we should back away from that. Turkey went from being supportive of Assad to the most gung-ho on overthrowing him, to deciding, well, all we care about is the Kurdish situation anyway, so Assad can stay and we intervene there. United Arab Emirates decided they were just going to live with him. Jordan. So yes, and then, the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. Trump, the first year was kind of confusing and different people saying different things, which is there was no coherent line within, but Trump basically implied that himself. I mean, he said Syria is sand and death. He sometimes, made some hostile comments about Assad, and he did the chemical weapon strikes, but we had moved on from regime change in Syria. And if we weren't going to do it and the neighbors weren't going to do it, then it wasn't going to be done. In that sense, the 10-year campaign almost to get rid of Assad is more or less over. And I think that's probably, the right place to be, because, we saw that modest escalation only perpetuated the war. It didn't end or solve the war. So again, it goes back to my point. If you want to make the case that we should take all of our resources, do whatever it takes to get rid of Assad, make that case and own the consequences. But doing it halfway makes little sense. I'm afraid, and I'll leave you with this, that we still may end up in this netherworld. As you know, there are congressional sanctions that don't allow anyone to do business with Syria or reconstruction assistance in Syria, which is understandable because Assad is such a cruel dictator and should be punished. But it's not really a policy in the sense that it's geared towards something better, right? So that's kind of the steady state. Syrians are suffering. No one can do business with Syria, and yet we're not doing anything to get rid of the regime either. That's a pretty unsatisfactory outcome.
Well, one last question for you, and especially this one just came in from an anonymous attendee, and I want to ask it. You talk a lot about your preference for containment and relaxation of tensions and engagement. Do you believe that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice in international affairs? Is that a particularly American way of thinking about it? But do you believe that we should hope for that, or do you just believe that we should just leave things rather than make things worse? It's better to leave things as they are than to make things worse.
I think it's somewhere in between. I don't think it's determined, and I do think we are an important variable. So I accept it neither as a given that the arc of the moral universe, heads in the wrong direction,
right,
nor as a given that it heads in the right one. What I'm really arguing for is trying to understand when you have a realistic chance to bend it in the right direction. And when you do, I think, you have an obligation and interest in acting to do so. But I don't think, and this is more of the relevant argument in this case, that you can just assume it as a given that if you get something out of the way of that arc, if we're using the right metaphors here, then it will move in a positive direction. In most of these cases, the opposite happened. You took a situation that was already bad and said, well, if we can help get rid of that, it will get better. And almost invariably, instead of it getting better, because of how difficult it is to get there and what happens afterwards, instead you're creating something potentially worse, which is, again, usually a security vacuum into which rush all sorts of competing entities. And then, you get a result where we're responsible for the outcome and have no realistic means of dealing with it. And the best cases there, which we didn't talk a lot about given their importance, are Iraq and Afghanistan, where, almost 20 years later, we're still there. It's cost more than $1 trillion, thousands of lives, and we still don't have even much of a realistic prospect of making it much better. So in that sense, my warning is not to assume that history moves in a positive direction, but to understand when you can help it and when you can't.
Well, I think that's a very sensible place to end it. I would encourage all of our listeners who have been stimulated by this conversation to make sure that you take a look at Dr. Gordon's book, Losing the Long Game. You'll find many of these arguments hashed out within it with lots of other historical examples. I encourage you to take a look at it. I want to thank Philip Gordon for joining us today on People, Politics, and Prose at FPRI. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
You bet. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here on Zoom. I apologize if we didn't get to everyone's question, but I hope that we got to enough of your questions. FPRI would love to thank our sponsors and partners for their generous support of this program, and encourage those of you who have attended today who are currently not sponsors or partners of FPRI to consider giving your support to this organization, which tries to bring these sorts of conversations to the public, because today's conversation is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we will continue to be here at FPRI to explain, debate, discuss, analyze, and as many other verbs as you could think of about international affairs. So if you've enjoyed your discussion today, tell a friend and bring a friend, and think about supporting FPRI as we gather to analyze our complex world. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. But until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I am indeed Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.